Good evening from Tokyo. I am Jeffrey Ordaniel, Assistant Professor of International Security Studies at Tokyo International University. Welcome to TIU International Affairs Seminar Series. I think there is no question that US-China strategic competition, or rivalry, if you will, continues to be the greatest shaper of 21st century international politics. This has not spared regionalism in Asia. Indeed, Beijing and Washington are presenting two different visions for regional order. These competing visions are encapsulated in their respective regional approaches: the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, pushed by China, and the so-called Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, championed by the United States. Aims to connect the dynamic economies of mainland and maritime Eurasia through improved infrastructure, connecting economic corridors extending from China to Central Asia and Europe, and from the East and South China Seas to the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific. Meanwhile, the United States, with the support of Japan, has put forward the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, that seeks to promote sustainable economic growth, free and fair trade, and a rules-based regional order. This is the emerging shape of 21st century international relations. But what do these competing visions really mean? What distinguishes one from the other? Are they mutually exclusive? Will these regionalization approaches force countries to make that difficult decision of siding with one over the other? What are the options available for countries like Japan, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka? Today, we are joined by a distinguished expert, certainly among the most respected voices in the academic community here in Japan on Asia policy, a good friend, Stephen Robert Nagy. He's a senior associate professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University. A little bit about our speaker. Dr. Nagy is a distinguished fellow at Canada's Asia Pacific Foundation and an appointed China expert with Canada's China Research Partnership. Previously, he was an assistant professor at the Department of Japanese Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong from December 2009 to January 2014. He obtained his PhD from Waseda University in International Relations in 2008. He has published widely in peer-reviewed international journals such as China Perspectives, the Journal of Asian Politics and History, and the International Studies Review on topics related to trade, nationalism, and China-Japan relations. He has also published in think tank and other policy outlets such as the China Economic Quarterly and the World Commerce Review on trade and political risk, and provides consulting services related to political risk in North and Southeast Asia. Before I turn over to our distinguished speaker, just a little disclaimer. All remarks, including those during the question and answer portion, are on the record, and we are live, not just through the Zoom platform, but also on Facebook. So please be mindful of that. So, without further ado, let me turn over to our guest speaker, Professor Stephen Nagy. Sir, thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thank you to Tokyo International University for hosting this great event. I'm really looking forward to sharing some ideas, and I'm going to just now switch to my PowerPoint presentation to try and make sure that there's some real take-homes for all our viewers today. So just give me a second. All right, just a thumbs up if you can see that. Yeah, great. Okay, so as Jeff mentioned, the Belt Road Initiative and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept or vision or strategy really are key frameworks for how this region is evolving. And you know, the United States and Japan and other countries are sharing a free and open Indo-Pacific vision, although they're slightly different. And I'm going to focus much more on the Japan side today because I think it's a more nuanced view about the free and open Indo-Pacific. And I'm also going to talk about the Chinese Belt Road Initiative and what does it mean for regionalization. So when we're thinking about this discussion again, why are we thinking about the Indo-Pacific? And this is a question I think for many countries, whether it's Australia, whether it's the United States, whether it's Canada, or whether it's European countries. Why are we focusing on the Indo-Pacific? And I think that's really critical if we're trying to couch or think about our national interests and our national strategy to engage in this region. Then I'm going to introduce the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and I'm going to contrast that with the Belt Road Initiative. And I think both of these initiatives do have some merit and some really interesting aspects of them, but they are distinct visions of the regionalism and the direction of regionalization going forward. I'd like to talk about some of the opportunities and challenges of both initiatives, and what I call possible crosswalks between the initiatives. And what this addresses is what Jeff mentioned in his introduction. Is there a place for countries to cooperate in the United States, Japan, and China? Or is there places where other countries can insert themselves in both of these initiatives? And my simple answer is it's not a Belt Road Initiative or a free and open Indo-Pacific. Rather, you can choose both. And then lastly, I'm going to end with this idea that I think these two visions really are a two-track regionalism. They're moving how regionalism is focused over the past 20 or 40 years from a north-south, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia integrating to two parallel forms of regionalism. One that's focused on through Beijing, and the second one is focused on the littoral states of the Indo-Pacific. So when we're thinking about this, I think it's really easy for us to understand why this region is so important and why many countries are considering crafting an Indo-Pacific strategy or vision. If you take a look on the right side of this slide, the world's population, 61% of the world's population is within the region. That means 61% of the consumers. 7 of the top 15 US trading partners are within this region. It's home to at least 50 out of 30 of the world's megacities, and that's increasing really year by year. And lastly, the US has at least 5 security partnerships within the region. And those security partnerships have provided a broad security architecture for the region. That security architecture has really allowed countries to prosper, to build their economies, and to really develop peacefully over the past 70 years. And I think that's really, really critical. At the same time, we have places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, which are really cauldrons for tensions and perhaps instability. And these areas are really a challenge for rules-based order, and they're a challenge for understanding how the region is going to develop. In particular, are states going to abide by international law in terms and the decisions of international institutions such as the Permanent Court of Arbitrations. And at this particular stage, we have many questions about this. Some other important aspects which really drive home the message that I think this is a critical region. It's home to at least 38 countries, 44% of the world's surface, 65% of the population, critically 62% of the world's GDP, 46% of the world's merchandise trade, and it goes on and on and on. 50 years ago, what happened in Europe and the United States would reverberate throughout the world. But now what happens in the Indo-Pacific region is going to touch all parts of the world. And it means that we need to start crafting policies that are focused on this particular region. Now, when we look at the free and open Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision in the case of Japan, or the Indo-Pacific strategy in the case of the United States, and these should not be conflated. They're different, but there are significant overlaps. They are important because they do link the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. They link the big North American economies to the East Asian economies, to the burgeoning or the emerging economies in Southeast Asia and India. And this is critical because this is where economic development is going to be driven in the next century. Now, the Japanese have put forward a so-called free and Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm not going to drill down into this because I don't think it's so important to look at this PowerPoint, but you can see that if you did a little Google online, you'd find that actually the official documents that the Japanese government has put out on the free and open Indo-Pacific aren't that detailed. It's very broad, but some of the key take-homes that I think that we can take home from their vision is it focuses on inclusivity. It focuses on infrastructure and connectivity, and this includes a digital economy. It focuses on trade. It focuses on promoting a rules-based order, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, in particular in the digital, maritime, space, and trade domains. And of course, it focuses on maritime security. Now, this is where we can think about some of the convergences of interests of many countries when they're thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And I've listed some countries up there: Japan, Australia, India, the United States, Canada, and the EU in terms of a region. But we can see that they have a lot of shared concerns in the Indo-Pacific and converging interests. So growing interdependence with China, and what are some of the consequences with that? And I think we've seen that this week with the Chinese government putting a 200% sales tariff on Australian wine. Economic coercion is a growing concern of many countries within the region. There's concerns about Chinese surrogates in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of nuclear development. And of course, that's the actors are North Korea and Pakistan. I think there's growing concern about how the United Nations and its United Nations Security Council can't seem to evolve to include other members, in particular Japan, India, perhaps an African state. And that's very much related to countries in the Security Council abstaining from any kind of change. Importantly, I think China's expanding maritime claims in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean are really a concern for many countries within the region, particularly focusing on what is the consequences for sea lanes of communication. In terms of international institutions and regional institutions, there's growing concerns of what's happening to institutions and associations like ASEAN. No longer they can function in terms of their consensus-based decision-making processes without being fractured, what I say fractured by outside countries. And this is a challenge for ASEAN centrality, and it's a challenge for how the region is going to develop. And ASEAN centrality has been a core principle for regional integration over the past 30 years. And if it loses its ability to function cohesively, this is going to challenge how we think about regionalism within the region. Most recently, I think growing convergences are along the idea of resilience in global supply chains. And in the COVID-19 pandemic period, we had a huge disruption in global supply chains. And this is really something that I think many countries in the Indo-Pacific are thinking about very seriously. And most recently, the Japanese government, along with India and Australia, have agreed to what they call resilient supply chain initiative, where they start to build alternative supply chains to build resilience into the system. And then lastly, I think an area of huge convergence for many countries is this idea of infrastructure connectivity. So really focusing on development and integration. And here the idea is that the more integrated the region is based on good infrastructure connectivity, is that they can self-strengthen their economies, they can improve their intra-regional integration. And by doing that, that strengthens their ability to have strategic autonomy vis-a-vis extra-regional players or inter-regional players. Now, that being said, there's many diverging interests when we think about the Indo-Pacific region amongst these major countries. Issue linkage, again, for example, India is not willing to support Japan and other Northeast Asian countries' concerns about nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. There's also different views about alliances and minilaterals. Again, India is not comfortable with these ideas of minilaterals and alliance politics. And as a result, it makes it difficult to institutionalize some institutions. And at this particular stage, I'm thinking about the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And I think if any of us watched the output of the October visit of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue foreign ministers, we saw that they came away with different takeaways. And I think that's important for us to be thinking about. Other diverging interests, I think, is really competing visions of what the Indo-Pacific is. Here, again, I think that the United States under the Trump administration has had a very different kind of view about the Indo-Pacific and about what the Indo-Pacific vision should be for the United States. And in particular, it had a very hard approach to China and particularly to the Communist Party, where Japan and other countries within this region, they need to focus on inclusivity. Their biggest trading partner is China, and it's quite unreasonable just to cut off that relationship. They also have different geographic understandings of the region. So, for example, India has a very clear view that their free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific vision really focuses on the Indian Ocean and not much into the Pacific. And then lastly, I think there's diverging interests in terms of the securitization of the Quad and the free and open Indo-Pacific concept or vision. And here, again, going back to the October discussions in Tokyo between the Quad members, they do have very different visions about how the Indo-Pacific vision should evolve. But let's think about some of the tools that we can teed out of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think one of the major tools is investment, and investment in infrastructure connectivity. And what we've seen is multilateral cooperation between the United States, Australia, and Japan in terms of financing infrastructure, and that's going to continue. That financing of infrastructure and trying to get private industry into connectivity and infrastructure building in the Indo-Pacific is really supposed to compete upfront with the BRI initiatives within the region. And we can come back to that, whether it's effective or not, but I think that the clear message here through Indo-Pacific visions within this region is that infrastructure connectivity should be focused on being fiscally sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and of course transparent. And by using private investment, at least these three countries feel that in part that is a way to secure those initiatives. Another important area that I think that is not discussed enough about Indo-Pacific vision, in particular from Japan's point of view, is the real focus on infrastructure and connectivity. And this is a map of the region of all the different infrastructure projects that are occurring through and under this FOIP umbrella. And you can see that there's the East-West corridor here in Southeast Asia, the Southern Economic Corridor in Southeast Asia from Northern Vietnam to Southern Vietnam. We also have connectivity projects in Myanmar, in South Asia, as well as South Asia. And just you can see a little bit better on this particular graph, but really these infrastructure projects that are being deployed under FOIP umbrellas are about promoting intra-ASEAN economic synergy. The view here is that Japan and other partners that are deploying infrastructure connectivity projects within South Asia and Southeast Asia, that they can foster more intra-regional integration, and that intra-regional integration will bolster economic dynamism, and that bolstering of economic dynamism will help with capacity building and really give them some more strategic autonomy in how they manage the relations, not only with China, but with other extra-regional partners. On the security front, the quadrilateral security dialogue is slowly gaining some momentum. And I say slowly gaining momentum because I think that the main members of the quadrilateral security dialogue are really looking at the region still from different points of view. And I've put down the Japan, India, Australia, and the EU here just for comparative points of view. And I didn't include the United States because I think the United States position is probably the most securitized compared to the other countries on this list. But you look at Japan's in trying to deal with some of the security challenges in the region through a FOIP framework, is using the quadrilateral dialogue to talk about energy access concerns, territorial disputes, and really this is seen through the economic expansion in light of Sino-Japanese rivalry. India, on the other hand, is looking at the quadrilateral security dialogue in terms of its backyard, the Indian Ocean, viewing port development and infrastructure development of China in and around India's backyard as really stepping into India's traditional spheres of influence. And they would like the quadrilateral security dialogue to deal with some of these issues indirectly, and I think through diplomacy. Australia, on the other hand, is also concerned about South China Sea assertiveness within the region, but really if you take a look at its July revised national security strategy that was put out by their Ministry of Defense, what we see is that they've slightly shifted their view of the Indo-Pacific, and they would like to focus a regional focus, in particular on the Pacific Islands and their northern domain around Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and some aspects of the South China Sea and East China Sea. And here, again, we see Australia engaging in this kind of regional focus to deal with security needs through the quadrilateral security dialogue, but also bilaterally when we see 2 weeks ago, Australia and Japan put forth a defense treaty or a defense pact to enhance their cooperation. The EU, on the other hand, is quite interesting. We see some members developing their Indo-Pacific visions, and those Indo-Pacific visions are also inclusive, and they also worry, and they state very openly that they have concerns about China, but at the same time, they don't want to over-securitize their engagement within the region. So what are some of the challenges in terms of the free and open Indo-Pacific? I think one of the important areas is sustainability. Is this financially sustainable? And I think in the post-COVID area, this is an even more critical question because many economies are going to be pulling themselves out of recession. And how much can they, how many resources can they provide to the region is a really, really interesting question. ASEAN balancing neighbors. The question here is for ASEAN countries, how much do they resonate with whether it's the free and open Indo-Pacific vision of Japan or the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States or other countries? Here we see ASEAN hedging their bets, and they put forth their own Indo-Pacific outlook, which really reaffirmed ASEAN's centrality and reaffirmed this idea of not taking sides. When we see the free and open Indo-Pacific, I think another challenge really is its low scale of investment compared to China's BRI. And this is really, really critical. And I'll show you some figures in a few minutes when we're looking at the BRI. The speed of programs as well. FOIP programs seem to be slower compared to the Chinese model. And this is not praising the model. I think it's a factor of the more rigid guidelines for infrastructure connectivity projects, focusing on fiscal sustainability, environmental sustainability, as well as other higher standards. And lastly, I think in terms of thinking about how FOIP is going to evolve in the region, it's really this idea of buy-in. Can an over-securitized approach to looking at free and open Indo-Pacific get buy-in from regional players? And this is a really open question. And I think countries like Indonesia, countries like Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, and even India, they are very reticent to have an overtly anti-Chinese free and open Indo-Pacific vision or strategy. And as a result, they do sit on the fence in terms of many of these different kinds of programs. And we'll come back to this in a few minutes. What about the BRI? Now, the BRI really is China's largest economic footprint in South and Southeast Asia. It's built on this premise of win-win, that China is trying to enhance economic development of countries so that they can help develop, but by exporting its overcapacity, China can also deal with some of its internal contradictions in terms of its economy. And for China, really, the Belt Road Initiative is really about this decreasing its dependence on the South China Sea and East China Sea for resources, and it deepens its dependence with other countries. And I'm going to come to this in a second. So in my interviews in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Nanjing with Chinese scholars, it's quite interesting to themselves how they understand the Belt Road Initiative. Some are looking at the Belt Road Initiative in terms of what they call new developmentalism, that this is a tool to help other emerging countries develop their economies, build infrastructure, connectivity. This will open up their economies to new markets, to new trading opportunities. And they view this new developmentalism of the BRI really through the lens of China's experience over the past 40 years. It was through infrastructure and connectivity development that helped China develop its economy, open its economy, and really create the circumstances for its growth over the past 40 years. Other scholars talk about geoeconomics, this idea that China is really trying to build economic interdependence and dependency with surrounding countries, in that China will be each country's biggest trading partner. And that's already a fact today. And the consequences of being China's biggest trading partner, of your country having China as your biggest trading partner, means that you're much more dependent on the Chinese economy than they are on you. And from many Chinese scholars' points of view, this creates a dependency that helps deal with some of China's security challenges with its neighbors. And again, we've seen this with Australia, with South Korea, with Japan, with Taiwan and other countries in terms of economic cohesion over the past few years. Other scholars have talked about this in terms of what we call economic autonomy, and they view the Belt Road Initiative in many ways as trying to recreate the American economic autonomy that it enjoys. So America has great neighbors. Of course, Canada and Mexico, no security challenges. Most of its trade is in North America, and it doesn't have any security challenges on the Atlantic and the Pacific side. So these scholars view the Belt Road Initiative as a way to reorient the Chinese economy so that it creates a dependency with surrounding countries so that it can export and import energy resources, imports and exports through Belt Road Initiative countries, which really decrease some of the security challenges that China faces in the East China Sea and the South China Sea and the Malacca Straits. So that goes to that last point of security. Lastly, I think many of scholars talk about China's own grand strategy, that the Belt Road Initiative is really about bringing Chinese public goods to the world, creating interdependency with other countries around the world through building interdependency that you can decrease the chance for conflict. And this will allow China to build new rules, shape their environment, and create new standards and regulations that favor China in a way that, for many of them, they feel that the current system doesn't. So there's a lot of views in China about the Belt Road Initiative. And again, looking at the kinds of money that is involved in the Belt Road Initiative is absolutely amazing. So up to 2016, about 1.4 trillion US dollars. And it's estimated at least another $4 trillion for all projects in 2017. And I think that this really speaks to the need of infrastructure and connectivity within the region and China's ability to put forward that infrastructure. I'm going to skip this because I think I can put this PowerPoint up for you afterwards. But the key take homes for you to understand from the BRI is really this idea of the five principles of peaceful coexistence. So China insists that the BRI is going to be based on this idea of non-interference and protection of sovereignty. And I think this is really, really critical. The idea that you have mutual respect for each other, that you develop on a win-win basis, and lastly, that you don't try to shape each other's future. Now, why this is important, again, I think it focuses on sovereignty, it focuses on non-interference, and these are really critical areas to understand how China is trying to shape the region in a way through principles that protect its bottom line. China does not want to be part of international institutions that can shape how governing occurs domestically. Xi himself has talked about the BRI in terms of globalization. He's talked about it in terms of that everybody should be together working to promote globalization, and that closing off your economy is not something that can really bring benefits to other countries. And again, he gave this speech at the Davos Forum in 2017 when there was a change in power in Washington, to directly contrast with some of the rhetoric that was coming out of Washington at that time. We see other rhetoric on China's understanding of the Belt Road Initiative, or at least how it's selling it, in terms of really not trying to create spheres of influence. And really, you see this process of trying to sell the Belt Road Initiative in direct contrast to how China understands Western countries in terms of how they've engaged in development. And that's development through trying to change, to enhance governance, to promote rule of law, to promote countries to increase their standards of how they govern themselves. And I think this is one of the core areas of difference between the BRI and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, is this ideas of really not trying to shape other countries and how they're evolving. When we look at and we drill down into this, I think that the key take home for all of you is down here at the bottom of this slide, is that the Belt Road Initiative is meant to enhance trade and investment. It's meant to build a free trade network, and these are designed to promote growth and in both the region and globally. So strong focus on building infrastructure and trade routes, and that this is meant to promote growth, and through promoting growth that you can enhance the level of integration and interdependency of China with receiving countries. So I think some of the key take homes that you can take are from the recent 19th Party Congress, where China really focused on this idea of really stressing that China is trying to further links eastward and westward and across land and sea. And what we see in the Belt Road Initiative is generally 5 land corridors and 1 sea corridor. The idea of focusing on achieving policy, infrastructure, trade, financial, and people-to connectivity. So really this comprehensive engagement with countries along the route in a non-binding manner, right? Again, protecting sovereignty and protecting protecting that idea of non-interference. So where are the opportunities and challenges here? I think that really one of the biggest challenges along the BRI is the consequences of creating economic dependent relationships. There's a danger of having too many eggs in one basket, and I think many scholars, when they're looking into BRI relationships with China, are seeing these kind of dependent relationship happening with the beneficiaries of BRI aid, and that means that it becomes more difficult to have your own political decisions, especially when they go against the decisions in Beijing. In some cases, I think there's growing uncertainty about feasibility in terms of these projects. And if you look where the BRI projects, they're often going through ethnic and religious conflicted areas. And you take a look at Pakistan, you take a look at some of the South Central Asian countries, these areas are really seen as highly prone to ethnic conflict. And the idea of bringing in the Chinese model, Chinese workers and Chinese infrastructure to build infrastructures in these areas and not cause ethnic tension or religious conflict is really creating challenges. And we've already seen evidence that this is becoming difficult in countries like Pakistan. Another key area, I think, is this idea of what happens if there's a financial crisis in the region. And I think we've already seen that with the COVID-19 pandemic, is that the model just doesn't work when borders are closed. China can no longer export their labor, their overcapacity, and that means those projects stop until borders open up again. So this is a health pandemic. What happens if there's a financial crisis? Will China be able to continue to finance its BR-related failures? Lastly, I think debt traps and neocolonialism are some other concerns about the BRI. I think that the debt trap itself is somewhat overblown, and I think that when you drill down into some of the examples of the debt trap, there's only one case that really comes to mind, and if you again have a granular look, the Sri Lankans are just as responsible for the financial misstep as the Chinese taking advantage of it. So I guess some of the key take-homes that I'd like you to think about when you're comparing these two initiatives, first has to do with what we call regional order. Japan and US FOIP ideas really focus on multipolarity with US leadership and a coalition of the willing. On the Chinese side, really, China is really trying to push this idea of a new type of great power relations with China and other countries. And this new type of great power relations is trying to forge what they call win-win relationships. And that does sound really good. The challenge is that when you're trying to form bilateral relations, there's really only one country that is as powerful or more powerful than China at this particular moment, and that's the United States. So your bargaining power does decrease significantly. In terms of values, we see the free and open Indo-Pacific being quite inclusive. And what I mean by that, it can include all countries. And we see that the Indian, the Japanese, and even aspects of the US Indo-Pacific strategy are meant to be inclusive if countries follow a rules-based approach. On the China side, really, it's exclusive. It's not interventionist to core interests. And I think that is a particularly distinguishing feature. Its agreements are non-binding, which means that the contracts can be broken. The FOIP is based on rule of law. BRI is based on non-intervention. I think the structure of the FOIP is really hierarchical. It's US-led, and it's horizontal in terms of a rules-based order, where I think most evidence suggests that the BRI is hierarchical for China, despite China not making that case. In terms of Asia policy itself and formulating Asia policy, really, FOP is trying to create autonomous rules-based and good governance development. And we see that in most of the documents associated with FOP, where I think the BRI is creating economic reliance on China, and that economic reliance will have consequences. And I encourage you to think about the recent track record of economic coercion. Just out of time considerations, I'm going to talk very briefly about potential crosswalks between these two initiatives. And here I think that Japan and China have already talked about infrastructure cooperation in third countries. There was some initiatives in Thailand that did go on, and I think that they've stopped in the wake of the COVID crisis. But this is an area where I think there is potential opportunities for cooperation between Japan, China, and the United States and other countries in terms of infrastructure cooperation in third countries. Healthcare is another area that I think, in particular, COVID-19 related healthcare is another area that I think there's going to open up in terms of crosswalks, in terms of cooperation between the BRI and FOP related initiatives. And here I think the new, the incoming president in the United States will probably take a somewhat different tact here in terms of trying to find opportunities to cooperate on the COVID era. And I think we saw this just this week with Foreign Minister Wang Yi from China talking to Prime Minister Suga, and Foreign Minister Motegi talking about the opportunities for cooperation in healthcare. In terms of non-traditional security, here's another area that I think there's opportunities for cooperation in terms of piracy, illegal fishing, climate change, and lastly, trade. I think that the recent signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships demonstrates that in terms of countries in this region, they don't have a zero-sum approach to dealing with other countries within the region, and they want to continue to promote trade as well as security with other partners. So lastly, I think that the take-home message for all of you is that I think the BRI really is a continental project. It's a continental form of regionalization versus maritime regionalization. The BRI really will continue to cement connections through infrastructure connectivity, primarily with land-based countries west of China and south of China, with some limitations. It will fracture ASEAN centrality and create challenges for ASEAN to function moving forward. Its form of regionalization will continue to be hierarchical, and it will and that hierarchical form of relations will be based on economic asymmetries. The FOP initiative or vision or strategy really, I think, is a regionalization process that's focusing on the littoral states or the maritime environment, and really would place China at the periphery of this maritime environment, but not necessarily exclude it from that maritime environment. We're going to see Japan and India play larger roles in the regionalization process, but also Southeast Asia, taking advantage of their maritime locations. And again, I think that the COVID-19 is going to accelerate this process with the understanding that supply chains need to be diversified. The global supply chains need to be recalibrated, not to decouple from China, but to create some resilience in supply chains so that we don't have another breakdown in global supply chains trade that we saw in the in the COVID-19 era. And I'll stop there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a very illuminating presentation. Thank you very much for walking us through this complex narratives on FOIP and the BRI. Having heard from our speaker, in a couple of minutes, I will turn to our audience for their questions. Many of those who are in the meeting are IR students from Tokyo International University, but we also have guests from outside TIU, including some from the diplomatic community in Tokyo, and also from other universities in and outside Japan, and from the media. So if you want to ask a question or to comment, please use the raise hand function located on the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Wait to be called before speaking. And please state your name, position, and affiliation before commenting or asking questions. Alternatively, you can also post your question on the chat. But if you're going to use the chat tab, please remember to identify yourself by including your name and affiliation. So just to jumpstart our conversation, let me ask the first question. You have mentioned in your presentation, Stephen, that countries in the Indo-Pacific region can actually choose both. And indeed, there seems to be conscious efforts from both the United States and China to be as inclusive as possible with their FOIP and BRI. The US seems to be welcome to join the BRI initiative, and that China seems to be welcome to embrace FOIP if it adheres to certain principles. However, realist thinkers would argue that these are mutually exclusive. The BRI initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific are mutually exclusive, that the US and Chinese approaches are fundamentally different, that it's pointless to expect the US to join BRI at some point in the future, and for China to embrace FOIP principles. In the area of maritime security, for example, you have one side saying international law should prevail in resolving disputes, on the other side arguing the nine dash line should prevail. So maybe uh, tell us your thoughts about this, and maybe give us more details about the potential crosswalks and how it is possible for countries in the region to choose both and not be pushed into a corner whereby they have to choose either the United States or China, either BRI or FOIP.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. Thanks very much for the comment. So I really think when we're looking at international relations and we're looking at the relationship between BRI and FOIP, I think that there is a security component in particular for the free and open Indo-Pacific vision along the maritime domain. But in this particular area that I think that to move forward in bilateral relations, you can't have a single track form of engagement. There's so many different pillars to these two initiatives that there are opportunities for having a multiple track of cooperation. So I mentioned the infrastructure and connectivity. Here, there seems to be a lot of overlap between the United States, Japan, and China, the need for infrastructure and connectivity throughout the region. The question is the difference in how strict they adhere to fiscal sustainability, environmental sustainability, and really leading, helping with development. And here, I think that we've already seen progress. We've seen the BRI. If you look at the first BRI forum, which happened in 2017, and you compared it to the second BRI forum that happened in 2019, what we see is that China has adopted many of those principles that FOIP has been encouraging: fiscal sustainability, environmental sustainability, and what this, I think, demonstrates is that there, in terms of the area of infrastructure connectivity, there's a lot of areas of overlap, and they can converge there. And in that sense, Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries, Japan, as the benefactors of infrastructure and connectivity, can be recipients of both, and there seems to be overlap. So here, again, I think that it's really critical that they start to not think about engagement through one track and using maritime security as, you know, an obstacle to engagement, but thinking about how other cooperation in infrastructure connectivity, building digital infrastructure, working in non-traditional security areas such as dealing with climate change, piracy, illegal fishing. These can be a platform for building diplomatic space to deal with some of the more difficult issues in the maritime environment. And I think that is the way that countries need to move forward. A zero-sum approach is just going to create challenges for many countries in terms of increasing feeling that they're going to have to choose between the United States and China. And we've heard it over and over, whether it's Prime Minister Lee in Singapore at Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, he said, countries don't want to choose. If you look at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, most recent survey on Southeast Asia, countries don't want to choose. If you look at Japanese Business Federation, American Chamber of Commerce in their recent surveys, they don't want to choose between China and the United States. They want to stay engaged, but they want things to change a little bit.
All right. Let's turn to the audience. We have one raised hand or two raised hands. Let's have Min Nguyen first. Uh, Go ahead, Min.
Thank you for joining us today. So I have one question. So as far as I understand, Trump's view of America first was set to sort of misalign with the principles supporting FOIP. So the administration has been trying to fix this misalignment by incorporating them with the idea of competition. So provided that there is a smooth transition towards the presidency of Joe Biden, will we see the revision of Biden's administration over Trump's version regarding this matter? So in other words, so will we see a return of consistent US engagement in the Pacific, leading a network of regional allies, or will we see something completely different regarding the policies of FOIP? Thank you.
Thanks, Min. That's a really great question. So I think that you might be surprised to hear this. I think there'll be a lot more continuity in policy within the region. I think that at the superficial level, President Trump seemed erratic, but when we look at the institutional engagement within the region, that I think that the Trump administration did engage within the region, and they did take on concepts like FOIP. You know, it was the Japanese, it was Prime Minister Abe that came to the table and said, this is a concept that you might want to adopt. You saw that as the Japanese put more focus on infrastructure, connectivity, and trade, we saw that the Trump administration started to adapt and change its FOIP engagement within the region. So I think that the new administration, if it comes in, as you mentioned, in January, will have a lot of continuity in terms of how the Trump administration engaged. At the same time, I think that it'll have a much more multilateral approach. It'll be an approach that it really focuses on dialogue. If you look at the Biden foreign policy team, they have experience within the region. They have a sense that ASEAN is an important part of the FOIP initiative. And I think that they have a different view that about how to address issues with China. And I think that they will have a hard view on China, but I think they'll move it away from an ideological view about China and really try to find opportunities, again, as I mentioned, a multiple track form of engagement with China. Try to cooperate on those difficult issues like climate change, but on maritime security issues, we're probably going to see a coalition of states to come and put more pressure on China in different maritime domains. But I don't think just in maritime domains. I also think in terrestrial domains such as the Himalayan plateau. Great question. Thank you.
Barry.
Thank you. Thank you, professors. Thank you for the very informative presentation. So my name is Ming, but you can call me Barry. I'm a third-year student here at TIU, and I actually have a couple of questions. So my first question to you, and as well as other guests, is this: because the South China Sea is still very a major issue concerning ASEAN countries. Could we potentially be seeing a more American-leaning foreign policy from ASEAN countries with Joe Biden as the new president? That's my first question. And my second question is concerning the BRI. I wanted to ask if there is any connection between the BRI and the Heartland theory by Mackinder. And I must apologize first because I'm not very familiar with geopolitical theories. So I would like to ask these two questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barry, or Min. You're another Min. You're from Vietnam. Great. Xin chào. Come
Yes,
on.
sir.
I have great Vietnamese students. So I think in terms of Southeast Asian, I think we need to be careful and just make a distinguish between Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN. ASEAN will not tilt towards the United States because of its institutional structure and consensus-based decision-making, which means that countries that are friendlier to China will not support any harder line on China. So I think that's we can't say ASEAN will tilt towards the United States. Now, what about Southeast Asian countries? Here, I think that we have a lot more variety. So I think the Philippines, Vietnam, and again, if you go to the most recent Institute of Southeast Asian Studies survey on Southeast Asia, very, very strong views of the United States, very supportive views of the United States. Singapore as well. So these three states, I think, would probably be on the front line of supporting a more robust position and presence of the United States within the region. But Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, they have a different view about how to engage in China, partly because of strong economic relations, I think partly because of China's diplomatic reach out, in particular in the COVID-19 area, providing medical equipment and medical goods and making promises about vaccines. We also have Indonesia that has tried to navigate and have a very nuanced position between China and the United States, refusing to take sides. So I think when to answer your first question, really, I don't think you can say ASEAN. You have to look at Southeast Asian countries and think about each country differently, and you know, what is their priorities? And I think they have some wiggling room, but I think even the most pro-United country like Vietnam, you know, remember they have a communist party leading the country. It's a socialist state. They have a lot to lose if something happens in China, and I don't think they want their relationship to comprehensively decline. I think that they want to ensure that the maritime disputes stay in the maritime domain, and other countries are very much like that as well. With your second question, really, yeah, you're talking about heartland theory versus maritime theory, and really the idea of China really is to try to dominate the Eurasia Peninsula through trade, and you create economic and social and cultural links, and those economic and social cultural links allow you to create laws and regulations and standards, and by doing that, you're really you're setting the table for creating a region that meets your national interests. And on the Japanese side, you know, they're looking at Mahan's theory of trying to dominate, or on the United States trying to dominate the maritime domain, because they view that dominating the maritime domain allows you to dominate sea lanes of communication, that those critical sea lanes for transport of energy, for transport of imports and exports. So really, it is competing visions of how the region should develop. And again, that's why I ended my presentation just saying that we have a continental versus a maritime view of how the region's evolving. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. We have one question from a colleague, Professor Hakin Lee, professor of Chinese politics at Tokyo International University. Let me just read his question on the chat. It seems that both sides, China and the US, together with Japan and Australia, or perhaps India, have their own regional agenda in shaping the Asia-Pacific regional order. Are the two sides engaging in zero-sum game? How can we conceptualize the regional order in the coming years or decades? Competition, confrontation, selected cooperation in certain areas? My second question, and I'm reading the question of Professor Lee. My second question is about the role of India. Modi said that Indo-Pacific should be inclusive and open. Even India has territorial confrontations with China. To every member in the region, open to every member in the region, which contradicts the American proposed rules-based order to some extent, which is specific in isolating China. So what does India think?
So thank you very much, Professor Lee. I think to answer your first question, I don't think the countries in the immediate region can take a zero-sum approach to their engagement with China. You know, Japan, South Korea, all Southeast Asian countries, Australia, their biggest trading partner is China. So to have a zero-sum approach is going to significantly damage themselves. So what we see, and I'll just focus on the Japan side, but we can also talk about the other countries if you'd like as well, is that we see trying to engage in China through trade agreements. And we've seen that with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We're likely going to see negotiations for trilateral FTA between South Korea, Japan, and China start to move forward after the recent signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And even President Xi talked about he'd think positively about joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, this demonstrates that the countries are not taking a zero-sum approach to engagement, but they're trying to embed themselves, in particular Japan is trying to embed themselves in the Indo-Pacific region so that they have strong economic ties within the region. They're part of shaping the economic order. They're part of shaping those economic norms. But I think that they're clear-eyed that China's asymmetric advantages in terms of its economic size and some of its core interests are counter to neighbors within the region. And as a result, what we see is that in the case of Japan, is that they strengthen their relationship with the United States. They try to carve out a leadership position with India alliance partnership, and we've seen that over the past 4 years. At the same time, we see countries like Japan and South Korea think about how to strengthen partnerships within the region. And again, the recent defense pact between Australia and Japan is a very good example of strengthening strategic partnerships. But we should also look at other countries, how they are creating new economic models to, again, not have a zero-sum approach. And the South Koreans have what they call a new southbound policy, where they're trying to engage in Southeast Asian countries economically. Taiwan is doing this as well. And we see Japan adopting financial legislation to diversify and build resilience in supply chains in Southeast Asia and South Asia. So really, we have a security pillar to their approach, and we have engagement a pillar to their approach. And I think that that is the direction they're going to continue to go. In terms of how we could characterize the region moving forward, I think that this will depend on a couple of different areas. I do think there'll be one of competition, and that competition is going to be primarily in the area of technology. I do think there'll be competition in the maritime domain in terms of security, and that's going to become intense, but the technological competition as China continues to develop its own indigenous technological capabilities, its 5G systems, a digital economy that is subject to Chinese law, and how it exports that along the BRI, is going to create challenges. It's going to create what I call a bifurcated technological system, where we're going to have a Chinese system and then a world system. And this will create challenges in terms of negotiating the relationships, in terms of investment, in terms of how we engage at the economic level. And the economic level has been the bridge to engaging in China over the past 40 years. And I think if we create obstacles to that bridge, we're going to have a relationship that moves away from competition to a relationship that could really create regional blocks. And this could be a challenge. How does India fit into this? I think India, and you hear this from Indians don't have so much concern about the Indian Ocean per se. Their concern is mostly on the terrestrial side of their relationship with China, and that is the area that the Indians are mostly focused on. And as a result, when they're articulating their views about the Quad, or their views about security within the region, or how they conceptualize their own free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific vision, really they want to make sure that China is not excluded, that they continue to have a zero-sum approach to China, and that they continue to strengthen their relationships in a way that gives India more strategic autonomy in the Indian Ocean and a strengthened position in the Indian Ocean.
We have a question from Bhuthmi Fernando from Sri Lanka.
Hello, Professor. I'm a freshman at TIU. I have a question.
You're a fresh woman.
Thank you. Do you think the signing of the MCC agreement by Sri Lanka will have a significant impact on the power dynamics of the Indian Ocean?
At this particular stage, I don't think so. I think that the power dynamics in the Indian Ocean are going to be primarily determined between the United States, China, and India. I think Japan was going to have an increasing position, prominent position within the region. And if you speak to policymakers in India, they have a very strong view that Japan should have a bigger role within the Indo-Pacific, that Japan should have a security role within the Indo-Pacific. So the question is will Japan have that role? And at this particular stage, I think Japan is limited by constitution in terms of having a more proactive role in the Indian Ocean. Second, I think that it's structural issues with regards to population, declining finances, that it also have limited resources that it can extend into the region. So that means that it's mostly going to be the United States, China, and India that determines the power dynamics in the Indian Ocean moving forward.
Mark Su.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Mark.
Okay. Thanks, Professor, for raising the issue about the debt trap Sri Lanka had. Not a lot of critics talk about it, so I thought it'd be a really good point to mention it.
Yeah.
Aside from that, I heard in the news that China's coming back to Sri Lanka because I heard there's an aid package for a port city. I forgot where in Sri Lanka, but yeah, at the same time, just made the news already after the RCEP treaty was signed. So I thought I'd raise those issues. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think when we look at there was a lot of claims about what happened in terms of the BRI project in Sri Lanka, but I think once we found out the facts, we did find we spoke to some Sri Lankan scholars a few months ago about this, and even then they were quite frank about there was no debt trap. There was actually mismanagement in the Sri Lankan case about BRI investment, and the Chinese basically signed a 99-year lease to secure that the money that they invested in Sri Lanka. So I think we need to be really careful about how we understand the BRI projects. But thanks, Mark, for the comment.
Han.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nagy, for your wonderful speech. I have a question regarding the visit of Japanese Prime Minister Suga to Vietnam and Indonesia. How much do you think that the visit will be impacts on Japanese vision on FOIP, and why they chose Vietnam and Indonesia? How much they important which Japanese vision in FOIP? Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much, Han. So I think it's a really important question. And if you look back to 2013, when Prime Minister Abe became the Prime Minister the second time, his first trip abroad was to Indonesia. And during that time, he talked about Japan's new principles of proactive diplomacy, and he talked about the importance of Southeast Asia. And throughout his tenure as Prime Minister, he visited every single Southeast Asian country, and some of them more than once, to demonstrate Japan's commitment to Southeast Asia. So I think Prime Minister Suga's visit to Indonesia and Vietnam really is doubling down on this messaging to suggest that Japan views both Vietnam and Indonesia as critical partners to shaping the region's development. Remember that both of these countries are at the most populous Southeast Asian countries. They have strong relations with Japan. They have depoliticized, or they don't have the historical issues with Japan. And Japan has invested heavily in terms of ODA, overseas development assistance, as well as FDI, foreign direct investment. And Japan clearly sees these two countries as critical partners in strengthening ASEAN's intra-regional integration. From Japan's point of view, strengthen these two countries, the biggest countries, arguably in Southeast Asia. If they can strengthen those two countries and have strong relations, they can also enhance intra-regional integration, which would allows ASEAN to function as it was designed, to have consensus consensus on issues critical to ASEAN countries. And it can only do that if there's more economic integration in the region. Japan wants to be part of that.
All right. Stephen, let me steer the conversation a bit to economics, since you ended your statement there. Recently, the world's largest trade agreement was signed, and there was a lot of hype, right? Experts have emphasized the fact that the United States is outside of it. and so many other things. So what do you think about RCEP? Is this much ado about nothing, or is this truly a transformational free trade agreement?
Well, I think that one of the critical aspects of RCEP is that it puts ASEAN back into ASEAN centrality back into trade. And I think that's really, really important. If you were looking at some of the media coverage, maybe critical media coverage, many critical media called this the China-centered deal, that this was going to make a China-centered regional economy. But I think, in fact, when you talk to ASEAN experts and Southeast Asian experts, it put ASEAN centrality back into how trade is working within the region. So from that standpoint, I think that's important. But when we compare the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement, with the Comprehensive, Progressive, and Trans-Pacific Partnership, this is where we start to see the quality of the agreement. So the Comprehensive, Progressive, and Trans-Pacific Partnership has 11 members. It has about, I think its total trade is about $7 trillion in GDP. And the population is about that are in part of this trade is about 500 million. But when we look at the RCEP, the total GDP that's going to come a part of that agreement, it's about 25 trillion dollars. But the population, of course, is more than 2 billion. So in terms of productivity, in terms of output of the two trade deals, the TTP-11 is much more significant in terms of quality of the trade, in terms of the standards, and in terms of the output of trade. So I think that that's a useful barometer to seeing what does RCEP actually mean for regional trade. But as you mentioned, the United States isn't part of RCEP, and it's not part of the TPP-11. And this means it's not part of making rules within the region. And I think this is a concern for Japanese, South Koreans, Australians, New Zealanders, that the United States isn't part of these trade deals. And I think that the recent signing, of course, was an important initiative as Japan, China, and Korea decided to sign this deal. But Japan in particular, and Australia, New Zealand, they're sending a strong message back to the United States that we want you in these trade deals. You're not part of these trade deals, and we want you to be part of the rulemaking process within the region.
What is the likelihood of the United States under President Joe Biden rejoining TPP and perhaps considering joining RCEP?
So RCEP, the United States can't join RCEP. It's not been set up in that particular way. In terms of the TPP-11, the Japanese have, under Prime Minister Abe, when he was Prime Minister, have left it open. They removed the chapters that of the trade agreement that were specifically targeted to the United States. And interesting enough, the 2019 minilateral trade agreement between the United States and Japan did cover some of the TPP material. But I think that the appetite for trade within the United States, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side, the appetite for international trade is just not there, and politicians are going to have a very difficult time selling that to the Trump voters, which there was 74 million, and the 80 million Biden voters. And remember, Trump said America first, but Biden said build back better. These are both of the same thinking. So for the United States to jump on board to the TPP, Biden is going to have to use a lot of political capital. And at this particular stage, I think his focus will be on COVID-19, rebuilding the US economy, and rebuilding US's global reputation for multilateralism, standing up for human rights, standing up for principles.
All right. Giovanni Catino has a question. Giovanni, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagy. It was a very interesting presentation. My question is about the, as you mentioned before, this global pandemic talks about the importance of diversify the global value chain, but also increase digital connectivity. And together with this came a lot of, I was reading an article there was increase of on cyber attacks against civil society organization, individual. Do you think that cyber security, digital connectivity, digital infrastructure can be an area of cooperation or of conflict between VA and FOIA?
So I think at this particular stage, I don't think it's conflict. I think it might be cooperation or competition. Now, when we look at digital infrastructure, that the Chinese offer something that's cheaper, something that's attractive, and I think something that's very competitive in terms of applicability, and from an emerging country standpoint. So, you know, we're all consumers, right? So our iPhones cost how much, right? Our iPhone 11 costs too much, right? And the Huawei costs about 1/5 the price. Now, if you are from an emerging country and you want to build and incorporate digital infrastructure and digital technologies into your economy so that you can develop more quickly, unless the price is right, and the Chinese have the right price at this particular stage, that you're obviously going to take the Chinese product. And it's a great product. Huawei products are really great. If you've seen the phones, they do almost everything the iPhone does, right? So I think that this area is about competition and price competition. It's going to be about cooperation when they can, but I think we should be very clear that when China talks about its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and it talks about non-interference, and it talks about sovereignty, that includes the digital economy, that includes the cyber domain, and this is fundamentally in contrast to what the free and open Indo-Pacific, what the pillars of the free and open Indo-Pacific is about: free and open, all right, and rules-based. So that means the digital economy, that means cyberspace. So we're going to have, I don't want to say conflict here, but we're going to compete. And the question is can non-Chinese digital economy providers and technology providers compete with the Chinese? And that's all going to be about price. It's going to be about competition. It's going to be about providing alternatives. And we're already seeing these kinds of alternatives come out. And if you've been following the news in Japan, I think it's Hitachi, and they have developed a new kind of cell phone system with ROM memory, and it's a competitor to 5G. So how much can we compete, and can we offer this at reasonable prices to emerging states? And if we can, then I think that it will be about competition and not about conflict. Great question, Giovanni.
We have a question from Tran Din Vu, but his mic is not working. So Barry is back to ask his question. Barry, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. So this is from Tran Din Vu, and he is a first-year student at TIU. His question is this: I would like to have a question regarding China's stand in the South China Sea. If China wants other countries to rely on them and be inclusive in the activities of the area, why are they creating this current problem and big dispute that is the 9-dash line argument? Wouldn't it be better for them to work more with the countries in that areas, like further investment of infrastructure, cooperation, etc., instead of creating problems in the Paracel Island, Spratly Island, the Tuna Island, and etc.? Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot in that question. So I think I'll start at one area that I encourage you to think about. The Chinese have a 9-dash line. And I'm going to ask you the question, why don't they have a straight line all around? And the simple reason is that a dashed line provides space for negotiation, a space to where the Chinese and other claimants within the South China Sea can step back. And from the Chinese point of view, if they ever have to speak to their public, they can say to their public, we had a dashed line, we didn't have a hard boundary. And I think this is an important signaling mechanism to say that this is not hard and fast, you know, this is our Chinese lake kind of viewpoint, is that they've created a space for some opening. In your question, you talked about why aren't they engaged in cooperation? And we have seen this, and there's a new scholar at the Sasakawa Foundation, Fabrizio Bozzato, And he writes about science diplomacy. And science diplomacy is where Chinese and Vietnamese, or Chinese and Filipinos, Chinese and Malaysians, they engage in joint underwater research to try and map topography and map currents and map for energy resources. So science diplomacy is occurring. It hasn't occurred much in the past since the building of artificial islands, but I think they have done that. I think last and really importantly is that you should understand how China's perceiving the South China Sea and the East China Sea as really not viewing it so much in terms of Southeast Asian countries, but viewing in terms of their understanding of US-Sino relations going forward. And back in the 1950s, there was quite a famous admiral in China, Admiral Liu. And Admiral Liu at the time talked about how China could, and he wrote about this. I encourage you to find his work, that if China truly wants to have security, that it needs to push the United States beyond the first island chain, beyond the second island chain, back to Hawaii. And that means dominating the East China Sea and the South China Sea and the Malacca Straits, because these areas, those sea lanes of communications, represent vital choke points that if there's ever some kind of, like, God forbid, right, if there's some kind of conflict between China and the United States, these are the natural points where the United States would apply pressure to China to get them to relent. So their viewpoint is thinking about the South China Sea and the East China Sea through this longer term competition between the United States and China. And this goes back to my point about the BRI. Why is it a continental project and why is it targeting certain countries? And if you map out, building railways through Pakistan gets you to the Indian Ocean. Building railways through Myanmar and to Singapore gets you to the Indian Ocean. These are all ways to cut off the Malacca Straits dilemma that China is very concerned about if there was to be some kind of conflict. So, it may not be fair, but I think that is the logic behind the Chinese when they're thinking about the South China Sea.
Interesting comment there, Stephen. And I want to build on that point. The point that 9-line is precisely a 9-line to create a space for negotiation. If you talk to diplomats from Manila, some of them have said that whenever they try to negotiate or engage with the Chinese on the issue of the 9-line, it always ends up with the Chinese telling them that what is ours, what is yours is also ours, but we are willing to share.
Yeah.
Do you see the Chinese position on security issues softening at some point in the future, considering its rivalry with the United States? I mean, there is it's sort of common sense that if China is serious in sort of countering the United States and pushing the United States out of Asia, that they need to make friends with countries in the region. And that perhaps means softening their security positions on the South China Sea or East China Sea and whatnot. How do you see this playing out in the future?
So my view is China's behavior can be understood through neoclassical realism. That what's happening domestically is the product of what's happening internationally is actually because of what's happening domestically. And under Xi Jinping, we've had a consolidation of power. We've had term limits removed at the 19-party Congress. We've had some, these signature initiatives such as the AIIB, the BRI being pushed out. We've seen, the National Security Act in Hong Kong being implemented to crack down in Hong Kong. We've seen the re-education camps being built in the far west in Xinjiang of China. These are all indicative of Chinese leadership and Chinese leader that is bent on consolidating its core interests within the region. And until those core interests, until it feels secure domestically, that it's going to have a lot of difficulty in terms of stepping back on these peripheral issues, in particular the South China Sea issues, but also I think, East China Sea issues. And this year is going to be in 2021, it will be the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party. So we should not expect any kind of softening of the Chinese stance in the build up to that anniversary on July 23rd, 2021. And guess what? That's actually the opening day of the Tokyo 2021 Summer Olympics. So that's also something that's going to be quite interesting to be thinking about. So post 70th anniversary, is there a possibility for a softening on the stance? This is a really, really interesting question, and it will depend on if Xi Jinping has been able to consolidate his authority within the party and as the central leader within China. And that's unclear. I think the pressure by the United States, the trade war has created huge pressure on the Chinese economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has also created huge pressure on the Chinese economy. And of course, all of China's neighbors and of course, Australia and Canada and many other countries, if we look at Pew surveys, are very concerned about the direction of China and the direction of its rule under Xi Jinping. So all these pressures will probably suggest that he will tighten control to protect his interests, and that will mean making compromises on peripheral territorial issues much more difficult.
Jesslyn from Indonesia has a question.
So good evening. Thank you, Professor Nagy, for your presentation. So I have a question. You previously mentioned that ASEAN and the Southeast Asian countries should not be considered the same. So I would like to know, I would like to ask, how significant is these countries, the Southeast Asian countries' membership on the ASEAN actually influence their preference on FOIP or the BRICS out of the Belt Road Initiative? Because as what we know, there has been like an ongoing conversation from the ex-diplomat in Singapore about expelling Cambodia from the ASEAN due to their relationship with China. Yeah, so I was like, will it be like ASEAN first, BRI first, or like FOIP first for these countries?
So thank you very much. Terima kasih. I'm very happy to talk to Indonesians. I spent some time in Sulawesi, really lovely time for 1 month when I was a graduate student. So I think that countries like Cambodia and Laos are probably have it more difficulty in terms of taking both aid from Japan and or from FOIP countries and from China, because China has a long-standing impact within the region. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I encourage you to read In the Shadow of the Dragon by Stephen Strangio. It's a new book by Yale Press, really good, an excellent read. And those two countries really, at many different levels, are really have tightened their relationship with China. And because they don't have strong governance systems, because they haven't developed strong legal systems, it's more difficult for them to stray away from China, but it's more difficult for them to adopt some of the free and open Indo-Pacific infrastructure connectivity projects, because really they do focus on transparency and fiscal sustainability and environmental sustainability. For Indonesia, they've chosen both. And remember, the Chinese won the bid for a bullet train, and then the Japanese also got some bids. So I think Indonesia has been able to get both countries to come in and help build infrastructure within the country. If you go to Vietnam, they have both countries building infrastructure in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh. So it's not a zero sum. Countries can take both, but I think countries like Laos and Cambodia, it's more difficult. Lastly, and I think really important for you to think about, is that the country that's probably invested most in Southeast Asia in the post-World War II period isn't China. It's actually Japan. And Japan has been deeply engaged in Southeast Asia since the 60s, since it was able to open up its economy. And it's done that through ODA, Overseas Development Aid, And it's done that through foreign direct investment. And I keep going back to the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies survey, but that survey says that the most trusted country in Southeast Asian countries is Japan. It's not China, and it's Japan because Japan is seen as a trusted partner. Japan is seen as being strict about infrastructure and all these legal requirements, but seen as a reliable partner. So I think that's really important for us to contextualize when we're thinking about Southeast Asian countries. And lastly, I think it's also important for us to be thinking about what is ASEAN's strategic reasoning or purpose or raison d'etre, and what are Southeast Asian countries constantly trying to do in terms of their own security. And that is to enhance their strategic autonomy vis-a-vis neighboring countries and extra-regional countries. And what that means, they don't want to side with China. They don't want to side with India. They don't want to side with Japan. They don't want to side with the United States. They want to make sure that they have the most maneuvering room possible. And that means working with everyone and choosing how they cooperate case by case.
All right, we are almost out of time. Very interesting, insightful, and engaging conversation on regionalism in Asia. So we will just end it here. Thanks, Stephen. A lot of takeaways from this seminar. On behalf of Tokyo International University, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. Also, special thanks to our 70+ participants from TIU and from outside of TIU. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to keep in touch with Professor Nagy, please shoot me an email and I'll try to connect you with him. That's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jeff, for a great event, and thanks to all the participants for the great questions. And do keep in touch. I look forward to hearing about from all of you.